Hi folks, another Tuesday evening. Welcome. Good to see people on the stream tonight. Hi Cookie Boy, great to see you on. And just to put the pre-show marker on at the moment, we're just warming up. The main show will start in a moment or two. Should explain I've got noises off. You may be following my roof saga. The guys will promise to be a little quieter over the next hour and a half or so, but who knows? We are getting through the work. The old roof was taken off. Of course, we had this tree come through, and the new one is being rebuilt. And they're putting the tiles on at the moment. So by the end of the week, it should be finished, which is amazing. So should have a new roof for Christmas. The dogs are here, of course, as always, just relaxed, having had their walk and everything else. So hopefully they'll be quiet over the next little while. And for those who have not seen the show before, this is the setup. Veronica's teed up, ready to come in over there, as you can see. And we've got the multi-view, we've got the chat, we've got the other bits and bobs running on over here. So everything is set up and ready to go. And we're going to have a really interesting conversation. I love the property chats with Veronica because she's got fingers in so many property pies and she's got really good views on so many things. So it's really an interesting conversation and nice to have her back on again. Anyway, that's enough pre-showing, I think. So I'm going to take the pre-show off. And then I'm going to start the show, and I'll be back in just a moment. Hello, good evening and welcome to this live show on the 10th of December 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on the show tonight and welcome one and all. I saw that Jason just popped in. Hi Jason, Cookie Boy's there and Leonie, James and a few others too. So nice to see everybody on. We're going to have a really interesting conversation this evening with Veronica Morgan, property exponent, expert, whatever you want to call her. She knows it backwards, forwards, and sideways. So it'll be a really interesting conversation. Just before I bring her in, remind you, as I always do, that we're not providing property or legal or financial advice. This is a general conversation only. Please play nice in the chat room. We are obviously doing this at the 10th of December if you're watching replay. If you want to get a question, throw it in at Walk the World. If you use at Walk the World to do that, it'll get into my queue, so I'll see it. There's a lot going on in the chat always, so I don't always see everything. So use at Walk the World. Also enable Super Chat, which means you can get your question top of the list or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated. We do this not for profit, but because we think there's a really, really important conversation to be had. So all help greatly received. Now, having got the formalities out of the way, let me push this button and bring Veronica in. Veronica, hello.
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, pretty good. The good news is the background noise has subsided, so they're working down the other end of the house for the benefit of the show, which is good.
Well done.
We had to have it done. I'll tell you what, it's really interesting having had plans next summer to redo the roof in the dry weather. Right, we got forced to do it because the tree came through. But actually, it's worked out quite nicely because the insurance are now covering quite a lot of the costs. So swings and roundabouts.
It's a win.
Anyway, welcome to the show. And for those who don't know you, Veronica, why don't you just, I never know how to introduce you because you have so many fingers in so many property related pies. So take it away. Just introduce yourself.
Yeah, I struggle with this myself sometimes. I'm a real estate agent, right? But I'm not like other real estate agents. My mission is to help people make better property decisions. So I help people in many ways. I've got a buyer's agency in Sydney. We launched a property management business in Sydney this year. I've got a new joint venture partner. We also have online education for first home buyers and for new buyers agents. What else do I do? I think that'll covers most of it. But I do a lot of property strategy with people. We have a podcast called The Elephant in the Room where we talk about the things that nobody tends to talk about in property. So, we'll keep busy.
Well, it's good. And, we've been having these conversations over the recent years. I remember our very first one when I think you sort of felt we were going to be butting, head butting. And boy, there were a lot of commonality because both you and I have a passionate interest in getting people to be more informed about property and making good property decisions, And people always say, "Oh, you always think property prices are going to fall." Like, no, hang on. There's a more of a story, and you too are saying, "Well, hang on a moment. There's more to it than just buy anything, right?" And I think that the message for tonight is nuance. Right? Nuance is really, really, really important when it comes to property. And so often, whether you look at what's happening in the mainstream media or whether you look at some of the spruikers that are out there, they just have turned off the nuance to zero, right? The truth is, nuance requires a bit more thinking, a bit more intelligence to make good property decisions. And I think hopefully we can get some of those nuanced thoughts and opinions out there tonight. Just as we come into this, we should highlight, of course, the RBA has left the rate where it was. No real surprise, I think, but they were slightly less bullish than last time. So maybe we will see a little bit of an earlier cut. Markets now saying February. No real surprise, but I guess you're probably seeing that there's a little bit of uncertainty in many people's minds about property and what they're doing. It's being reported in the media. So give us your top line view at the moment as to what you're seeing and specifically, the indicators that you're looking to.
Well, right at the minute, I mean, here we are, 10th of December. It's hard to know what's happening in the market, whether that's actually about the time of year or whether it's about other factors such as inflation, such as interest rates, etc., unemployment, just general cost of living pressures, all of that general sentiment, negative sentiment that's out there. And to be quite frank, if I look just at Sydney for a moment, the market has been remarkably resilient up until the last weekend. And the last weekend's the first weekend of December, and that's a lot later that it really starts to drop off than in other years, than in most years. And I know CoreLogic came out and said that there was 0.8% fall in Sydney property prices in the last quarter. That I think the Herald reported that as a tumble. But if you even look at and so Sydney's been a bit sort of ordinary all year. Melbourne's been pretty in the doldrums. But you look at Perth and Adelaide and Brisbane have been gangbusters all year. Yes, they've slowed down, but pretty much everywhere slows down in the lead up to Christmas. So it's hard for me to tease out what it is, whether it's seasonal or whether it is more systemic.
Yeah, actually, you see, I think that, again, these high-level stories about properties booming or properties busting is missing it, right? I can point to you at the moment areas in Sydney where prices are very, very strong and people are still buying. They're paying big dollars. A lot of those are houses rather than units. I can point to other areas of Sydney where units are still now valued lower than they were in 2017, 2018. And I'm also seeing people who've actually gone into the market, made really bad decisions, and they're now regretting it. So again, it's really, really important to be nuanced. And look, it's an interesting little observation. Thanks to Cookie Boy for this. The Australian housing affordability plummets to all-time lows, according to the Real Institute of Australia. The average affordability now is 48.6% of the median family income of just over $2,500 a week, according to their analysis. And they actually put this little chart up, which sort of shows that it varies. New South Wales is most adverse, ACT a little less so, but still quite high. And the rentals, of course, also all over the place as well. Now, that is somewhat useful. But I have to tell you again, I don't think it tells you a very good story. It's average. It's too averaged to be really useful. And that's why I do a lot of my analysis right down at the postcode level and look at individual households and individual situations. And we're going to get into a few of those by way of some questions that I've got. Some of them have come in today, some of them have come in earlier. Because what I want to do is explore a little bit about sort of the life events that take people through property, from the first-time buyer point of view, from the maybe investor point of view, from the down trader, and an up trader point of view. Because at each stage, there are a series of decisions that people need to take. And sometimes those decisions are not as straightforward, not as obvious as you might first think. And so I thought this might be quite a good way to explore some of the dynamics that we're seeing and some of the questions that the people should be thinking about. Again, this is not to turn people off property, but this is to help people make better decisions by just putting on the table the questions that they should be asking. But I guess we should also acknowledge that rates have been higher for a lot longer than a lot of people thought. And certainly in my service, I'm seeing a lot of people who are under significant pressure.
Some people are under enormous pressure. Of course, those people that purchased, this side of COVID, really, particularly when they purchased with really low interest rates, they weren't used to higher interest rates, and nor had they had the opportunity to build a lot of equity. So they'd be particularly vulnerable, and perhaps didn't have nice big buffers either. So there are a segment of the market that is, particularly, hard hit by the length of period of time and also the amount of interest rate rises that we've had. But the other thing too is interesting that, you talk about micro markets, Martin, or really getting down to the micro versus macro. And there's, all the headlines are all aggregated, and you can't aggregate a city, let alone a country. And certainly even the REIA data there, that was by state. Well, I'm sorry, but, the housing situation in Dubbo is very different to what it is in Wollongong, is very different to what it is in Byron Bay versus Sydney, just to give some context there. So nobody can make any decision with those sorts of figures. And the other thing too, that in some suburbs it's more homogenous, and you're going to have more people with mortgage stress, and that would be typically house and land packages, where a lot of the demographic is all the owners are the same. They've owned the properties for the same amount of time. They've probably got the same level of debt. They might even work similar types of jobs, have similar amounts of children. There's sort of a much more homogenous type of person, and the stock and the property is very homogenous as well. Versus where you look in more established areas where you might have a street where you've got somebody bought last year, but somebody else bought 50 years ago, somebody else bought 20 years ago, somebody else bought 10 years ago, somebody's paid their house off, another person's refinanced it, one person's got 3 investment properties, the other one's got none. You know what I mean? So when you're looking at more established areas, it's so important to get down to the micro, because individual properties will perform very, very differently. Whereas in areas where there's a lot less variety, a lot less scarcity, if you like, because the stock is very similar, then, those conversations you'd be having, people living and owning properties in those areas, would be, I guess, a lot more fear-filled than somebody who's living in a more established area where others are not facing the same pressures that they are.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the pressure I'm seeing is in homogenized areas where you've got, the stamp of another property, whether it's a house or whether it's an apartment. So there's no scarcity. They're all pretty similar. They're probably not that well built from a quality perspective. And in some cases, people were persuaded to do a financial structure that wasn't necessarily that advantageous as well. And all of those things have come together and created significant pain and problems. There are other people who've got more unique properties with perhaps some, a little bit of unusual position or location or something else that perhaps, stands out. And I would also highlight, I do still see the very big difference between units more generally and houses more generally, because, there are some dynamics that are quite different. But again, you got to go granular, because what's happening in southwestern Sydney with regard to houses is not the same that's happening in Wollongong, is not the same that's happening up in the Northern Beaches.
And then particularly with units, I mean, first home buyers in Sydney really have to think about buying units, because it's really difficult to buy a house, right? So if that's the case, they need to learn, well, what areas should they be looking at if they're going to buy a unit, and what types of units should they look at? And so units aren't bad for everybody, but there are, and I can talk to Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, they're the 3, I guess, big cities where there's been a lot of unit developments. And, you've got to be very, very wary, because there's a lot of very, very terrible buildings, and a lot of just, even if they're built well, they're not good, properties to own. There's the unit conversation. There's a lot of nuance in that. I could go into it, but well, let's see what the questions are, I guess.
Well, let's start there. So the first one comes from Olivia, and she actually is one of these down traders. So she down traded a couple of years ago with her family from a large house into a unit. It's actually up in the Northern Beaches of Sydney, so it's a 6-story unit. But the shocking thing for her has been, over the last couple of years, is the rise in the strata fees. So she was given some guidance as to what the strata fees were likely to be, and she based the calculation on affordability of the strata fees in line. So 2 questions. Firstly, when somebody tells you what the strata fees are going to be, like the agent, do you believe them? And secondly, if you're thinking about buying a unit, you need to be thinking much harder about not just a point in time, but ahead. And so her questions are a bit of a warning to other people. When you think about buying a unit, don't just look at what you got there. You got to think more broad.
Yeah. Well, you got to think broad anyway. I think too many people are making short-term decisions when it comes to property. And, the headlines that we alluded to earlier, I mean, headlines encourage short-term decision-making. They encourage knee-jerking. But anyway, onto apartments. The way she said that she was told the levies would be suggests to me that the property might have been brand new when she bought it. Yeah. And so, of course, nobody knows what the levies are going to be, really. I mean, that quantity surveyor's gone in there and come up with an estimate. And then over time, you find out really what that building costs to run, and also really the maintenance involved. And a building that's 6 years old, there's potentially there's warranty issues and all the rest of it, which often need to get funded by the owners corporation before you get to a resolution with a builder or developer to fix them, if they are going to fix them. And quite often when they do come to a resolution, it doesn't cover the full cost of defects. So in that whole period of time, sometimes there's legal action as well. That all has to be funded. And sometimes that is what causes strata levies to rise really unexpectedly and fast in newer buildings, because you've got to cover the cost of that whilst you're chasing down all those avenues to try to get the builder to make good. So there's a number of reasons why that might have been the case, but generally and broadly, insurance premiums have gone up substantially in the last 6 years. I'm saying 6 years, but 6 stories. But, since she bought that, insurance premiums have gone up a lot. There's been a lot of fairly negative media around strata managers and the deals going on with insurance, but that's another topic. But general maintenance costs have gone up. The cost of living has impacted running buildings as well. So that's another reason why the levies may be higher than was anticipated.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the conversation that I had with Olivia, and it was through one of my one-to-one conversations. And by the way, this was she allowed me to use this example on the show tonight. Was that she thought she'd done her due diligence well, so she thought she'd asked all the right questions, right? And so she had a survey done before she moved in after it was completed. She had worked to look at the builder and the history of the builder, but she hadn't thought through the forward trajectory of the running costs of the property, because she had assumed that the property was going to be effectively in pretty good nick, and that the running costs by way of the strata levies would be in line with what was actually indicated. And so the message is, you can't assume that. Okay, inflation's a lot higher, building costs have gone up, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that I'm seeing quite often in my surveys is a lot of people are being caught out with these massive rises in strata costs. Yep. And I have to tell you that there was quite a lot of reporting recently of pretty crooked strata management companies being involved in this as well. So, some of it's just normal course of business. Some of it is perhaps a bit more suspect, and trying to get control of the strata levies and the strata management company is quite complicated particularly in a high-rise environment. And of course, if you have a lot of investors there who really aren't at home, it can be even more complicated. And that was the other thing that, in the conversation, she highlighted the fact that the costs, although they were being spread across everybody, some of the investors weren't ponying up. And so what they were having to do was to spread the costs across those who were living there, because they got a captured community. And so she's really now seriously wondering about whether she should get out. Now, the second part of this conversation then is, if you've got into a strata environment and you know that the strata fees are continuing to rise, is that going to put downward pressure on the value of the property ahead? Because I would have thought that the next prospective purchaser, if they were going to do due diligence, would be asking those very questions.
Well, I don't encourage people to buy off the plan for lots and lots of reasons. And this is one of them, is because there's no actual history. So when you get a strata report on a building that exists and it's had a number of years in existence, then you've got history. You've got history of the actual cost of running it. You've got the history of the maintenance of the building. You've got the history of the actual way it's run and the community that runs that building. You've got you've got you can see how much sinking fund or the capital works fund that balance that they've actually built up in that time. You can look at the sinking fund forecast or the capital works fund forecast. Sorry, it's changed the term in recent years. The capital works fund forecast, and you can compare how they are budgeting versus how that has been done. So there's look, and look, this is not all perfect. When you look at as many strata reports as we do in my business, you start to learn to look for what's not in the strata report rather than what is in the strata report. So I think it's sad for Olivia, but it does highlight the problem is that if you don't know what you don't know, then you think what you're doing is enough, but you really do not know what else is missing. And that is one of the problems. When you are buying brand new, you are buying with faith. And yes, you can check out the builder and you can check out a number of things, but there is no history to check. And so when you're buying an existing property, the history is there. Now, other people might come along and they might not have the same view as Olivia. They might look at the way the levies are and they might go, well, that's quite normal in a building of that size with, that size apartment. It's all, I guess, is it in line with what else is on the market? So if that particular property is out of whack with other properties of similar size and similar sort of value in the area, then yes, that is going to be put downward pressure on the price that they'll get for it. But if it's roughly about the same, then it's not going to stand out to buyers as being particularly problematic. They're going to look at that and go, well, that's the same as other properties, so therefore that's not such an issue. But yeah, it sort of comes down to what other issues are coming up in the strata report as to whether that's a problem for resale. But also, I see a lot of buildings that have really low strata levies, and I think they're dangerous because I worry that they're not investing enough in building up the capital works fund so that when they do have major problems, because all buildings require maintenance, right? All buildings. And even when you buy a house yourself, you need to maintain that. Martin, you're lucky your insurance is covering your new roof. But if that didn't happen, if you didn't have the serendipitous tree falling on your roof, you would have to foot the bill for that, right? And as a homeowner, you get the discretion of whether you're going to have a separate fund and actually self-insure effectively and contribute over time, say a monthly amount, so that when you get hit with your big bills, it's not such a shock and you've actually got a fund there to pay for them, or you pay for the lot as and when things need to be done. And you have that discretion when you own your own home, when you own a house, where you don't have that discretion with apartments. And so it's about budgeting for everything that needs to be done. And, I like to look at buildings where you're not paying for the sins of the forefathers, in the sense that you haven't had a bunch of owners that have been cheap and didn't want to pay, and build up that capital works fund. I want to see people who've invested in the building. I want to see a history of that. And that gives me more confidence to invest into that building now.
Absolutely. The concept of a sinking fund, in other words, you put some money aside every month for the rainy day that is going to come at some point. So at some point, you are going to need it to be able to maintain the property and improve the property over time, of course, as well. And by the way, just on that, quite often some of the improvements people do are superficial, rather than actually some of the real structural stuff that should be being done. And that's a number of times that I've gone into property and it looks superficially shiny, but when you actually sort of peel back the onion, you think, oh, hang on a moment, what about the roof?
Lipstick on a pig, we call that.
Exactly right. Okay, here's another one. This is from Ronnie. And Ronnie is a first-time buyer, and he's trying to get a house. He's got a reasonable deposit, but trying to work out, he's actually based in Sydney again, do I go local to the centre of Sydney, or do I go further out? And everyone's saying, go further out, go further out, go further out, because you can actually get better value. Okay, you may have to buy a homeland package, etc., etc. But he said, the thing I don't think I've sort of thought through sufficiently is the costs of tolls and the costs of transport when you live further out. Yeah. So I was encouraging him to sort of build a bit of a cash flow and to work out what he needed to figure out. And we started then just calculating the weekly toll charges to go from Western Sydney into the centre of the CBD, which is where he works. And, he needs to drive rather than actually go by train. And suddenly that changes the complete dynamic on, is it affordable to move out? Now, I don't hear many people talking about this when they think about just go out.
They really should, because the reality is that, there's a good reason why properties that are close to the city, or land that's close to the city, is worth more than land that's further out. And that's one of the reasons, Ronnie should be looking at your first home buyer guide, which which is our podcast and the course that we do, because we have a lot of people that ask very similar questions. We've actually just created a Facebook group too, and we get this very similar question, like, what should I be doing? Buying smaller, closer in, or bigger, further out? And the answer is not going to be the same for everybody, right? Like, if you're thinking you're going to be wanting to have kids at some point, or it depends on your age. We talked about, you mentioned life cycle earlier. So much of it depends on where you are now, but not just now. Think of 5-10 years in the future as well. And a lot of people, in my first property I bought, I was thinking with my head on for right that minute. Honestly, I grew it in a year. So you've got to be very careful. Yes, you've got to factor in all those costs of living further out, but you've also got to be thinking, okay, well, if I live closer in and I can afford something, how long will that serve me? Because the transaction costs can really eat into upgrading and can stop people from upgrading as well when you need to. So you really do need to sort of map out what you need now versus what you need in the medium term. And those have to be important considerations. But listening to anybody just says, oh, go further out because it's better value, that is just garbage. It's like all the investors now, forget the fact that Brisbane's been booming for the last couple of years, but 10 years ago, or for about a 10-year period, Brisbane apartments did absolute jack shit. Can I swear? They did nothing. In fact, they went backwards, right? And people, Sydney-siders, were going, oh my God, for the price of a 1-bedroom in Sydney, I can get a 2-bedroom apartment in Brisbane. And so that's much more affordable. That's like better value. And so I'm going to invest up there. Not that I'm saying people should have been investing in 1-bedroom apartments in Sydney either, but the mentality was that I got more bedrooms, so it must be better for the same money. They weren't thinking about, is it a good asset? Is there a demand for those sorts of apartments? Is it going to rent out? Well, there's so many other considerations, but instead they're going, well, it's bigger and it's for the same money or less, so it must be better. But it actually isn't necessarily the fact.
Yeah, and I'd say that, good to do the calculations and work out what the cash flows look like in different scenarios, right? And you have to be holistic. You have to think about the rates and the power and, the maintenance. Travel, hugely important though, because the cost of travel, the cost of getting around are just so much a bigger part these days of people's budgets. And insurance as well, the other thing that people always forget to take account of. Now, when you've actually sat down and done the math, you end up with a different story. Go on.
Well, yeah, and I was going to say that insurance is becoming more and more of an issue as well. There's been all this rezoning, which I need to find someone to interview on the elephant in the room about this. Water map or flood maps have been redone in Brisbane and Sydney and I think elsewhere as well. And areas that were not in flood zones are now in flood zones, even though they've never flooded, and that's impacting insurance premiums. So these are important things to look into before you go ahead on a property. Check whether it's going to be easy or prohibitive to insure it, but also think about the length of the commute. Right, driving in Sydney is not fun when you got to be on the road for a long time. It's It's actually very unpleasant. So you got to factor that into it as well. Like, I can do this commute and I'll be in my own car and all the rest of it. Do I want to? Try it. I would actually suggest trying it. If there's Airbnbs out there or whatever, go and check that commute out and see whether you can see yourself doing it every day. Maybe you can.
Yeah.
Maybe you can.
Very good advice. I have to say that a number of people who have gone out and discovered it's terrible because they didn't actually go through at peak hour or peak 2 hours or 3 hours, right? It's very different in the middle of the day compared with morning and evening. And the number of times they got caught out is pretty, and it's day in, day out, day in, day out. I know people say, well, I can work from home these days, but more and more people are being dragged back into the office, kicking and screaming in some cases.
Yeah.
So this is another case where you actually got to really think through the issues quite carefully and clearly. And I think the other point just to highlight is when you're buying further out, what you're doing is often buying a new property, a home and land package. Remember that they're still going to build more stuff beyond. So your property that was new when you bought it won't be new anymore. There'll be other new property just a little bit further down the road. And so the values don't necessarily hold out that well when you actually are buying on the outer suburban ring.
No, they don't. And, aerial maps are very useful to thinking, well, okay, what could be built out, on and on and on and on. A lot of landholders of these big subdivision sites, they stage these developments and they've got them sitting there, and then one day they're going to develop them, and then that's going to impact on the value of your property, because the important thing to think about too is that brand new house and land packages in particular are sold, and same with brand new apartments actually. They're really pitched at two market segments. They're pitched at the first home buyer with all the grants and incentives you get to buy them, and they're pitched at investors because investors get a higher degree of depreciation on brand new. Even if it's 1 year old, they get a lot less depreciation than they do when it's never been lived in. And so you've always got to be thinking, who's my buyer going to be? If this property currently only appeals or predominantly appeals to first home buyers and investors, and then I go to sell and it's no longer appeals to a first home buyer or an investor, who is going to want to buy it? Because all of those people are going to go to the brand new suburb next to it.
Yeah, it's a moving problem, as you can see it again and again. I've had a number of conversations with people who bought 2 or 3 years ago, suddenly found that the pressures of their mortgages is becoming really, really now very, very, very concerning, and are looking to try and get out, and then they get a valuation and discover they've lost capital as well. So can be a nightmare situation, particularly when you are buying off the plan, delayed until, when you commit and when you actually get in the first place. And often the construction quality isn't great either. Here's another interesting one. This is from Keith, and it relates to zones because of school catchment areas. So he's looking at Cremorne and the areas around Cremorne, and there's a particular school he wants to send his kids to. And he's noticed that there's a sort of quite a discrete boundary around the particular catchment area for the school. And he can see a difference in price whether you're one side or other side of the catchment area. How important are school catchment areas when you're thinking about property valuations and property attractiveness?
It's very location dependent. There are some areas where absolutely it's very, very clear. And some of the dangers there is that, particularly if you're buying on the edge of the catchment, those catchments can move. Those boundaries can move. And, if you're bought on the edge and your kid's not yet at school, and then by the time your kid goes to school, it's moved and you're outside the zone now. I mean, that's a risk that you need to be very aware of. I also encourage people not to get really hung up on that, because I've known people that have people do. I was a bit hung up on it too when my daughter was, that age. She's just finished school and I'm yeehaw. And I realize the longer you get into it, you realize it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter, in my view. I know people will argue with me about that, but anyway, I don't believe it matters. The kids don't necessarily thrive in the school you think they're going to thrive in. And even if you've got more than one kid, different kids thrive in different schools, and they actually move around a lot, So maybe looking at the less expensive part of the suburb and going to the less, the lesser school isn't such a bad thing, really. But that's more psychological, I guess, that the reality is there are certain suburbs where maybe not so. With high schools, the catchment area for selective schools, for example, is something, because they've got to take the local kids in. They don't have to pass any exams or assessments to get in there. Primary schools, even, there's a lot of people that get really head up on the primary schools. But I've also known, and where my daughter went to primary school, for example, is a very small school, and I was very, very keen on her being in that school. What I didn't realize is there's pros and cons. When they're really little, being a small school is great. As they get older and they progress through primary school, really they could be in a bigger school, be better for them. But that I didn't know. But what I also didn't realize, because I was so relieved to be on the edge of that catchment area, was that there were a lot of kids there that were outside that catchment area, and they were there because in the public school, at least at this particular public school, that particular principal was very keen to have the numbers up enough to have added resources, so I could get an extra teacher. Actually, so the principal didn't have to be a teaching principal, those sorts of things. So there's all sorts of political stuff that goes on in these schools as well. And I think people might be surprised that they can actually get into schools sometimes that are outside when they're outside the catchment area. So I'm not saying that that's going to happen everywhere, but I'm just saying people get a very head up on this stuff. Yes, it can affect prices, but if you want a backdoor way of getting into an area, maybe you can still get your kid in that school and you can actually buy a cheaper house.
Yeah, again, it's nuanced. I don't think it's as a big a deal as many people seem to think it is. And as you say, there are tricks that you can do. But I do find people get fixated on it. It really is fascinating, right?
They do.
Yeah.
And it's like, and then, the amount of people I've met that have been fixated on it, bought a house or rented a house, because they wanted the kid to go to, little Johnny to go to this school. And then because of that sort of person, they pick the eye teeth out of the school and the teachers and the rest of it. And the next minute, little Johnny's been transferred to another school because the school wasn't good enough. Anyway.
Yeah, and things change, right? So catchment areas change, the quality of schools change as well. So that's worth just bearing in mind. Okay, here's a really...
The principal can change. So this is the other thing. When Molly, my daughter, went to this school, the principal, the reason that everybody loved the school, well, she left actually the year, just at the end of the year before Molly started. So she never got any of the benefit of that anyway. So things do change. Well, you're muted, Martin.
Thank you for reminding me. I turn my mic off every time I stop speaking, so trying to keep the noise down. So here's an interesting one. The particular guy, we'll call him John, was actually a property investor in Tasmania, actually in Hobart. And he's watched his property investment there, it's a house, drop in value over the last 2 years. And he's thinking, is it going to continue to drop? And he's looking at Perth and thinking, well, property prices in Perth are really going really strongly. So he's thinking, should I cut my property investment losses, sell in Tasmania, Hobart, buy in Western Australia, Perth? And I sat down with him and we went through all the numbers. It would cost quite a lot to do it. The returns, of course, are negative from a cash flow perspective in and around Hobart. The returns are positive from a cash flow perspective in Perth. The capital appreciation forecasts in the Western Australian area are still higher, not so in Tasmania. So superficially, it might look like a good idea, but boy, there's a bunch of questions that you've got to ask.
Oh dear. It's actually very interesting because I was just going back into some podcasts that we did for Home Buyer Academy, Your First Home Buyer Guide, and we were reviewing some. It was only 3 or 4 years ago, and or it might have been one of our mini courses, and we were talking about the fact Hobart was so hot, just and now Perth's so hot. So I wonder how long ago he bought in Hobart, why he bought in Hobart, and I'm guessing it was like Hobart was on the way up. Everyone's buying in Hobart, got to get into Hobart. And this is the problem with chasing the sugar hit of a hotspot. It's the problem because no one thinks, okay, well, this is a merry-go-round or a roller coaster. I've got to get off at the right point to make this work. Peter Kalizos, I'm not sure if you know Peter, he's known as the property professor. He did some research some time ago and he sort of looked at all capital city movements and worked out if you perfectly timed all your buys and sells, included your transaction costs and all the rest of it, could you have outperformed the Australian market average, Australian property market average, if you'd actually traded and chased all these highs and lows? And the overall gain was so negligible it wasn't worth the risk. So, so I think once we make a decision on an area, we need to just hunker down and stick to our decision, right? And so because he could be chasing Perth, by the time he gets into Perth, he's got to sell out of Hobart, then he's got to buy into Perth, and then by the time he does that, he's could be the greater fool because at the end, the Perth round, roller coaster is going to go down again at some point. I was interviewed Damien Collins for the Elephant in the Room podcast today. He's a Perth-based property expert, and he's been around a long time. And he was talking about the downturn from 2008 to 2020. Yeah, 12-year downturn. He bought a property in 2021, a home to live in, his own home, and he paid less than the previous person had paid, I think he said in 2008, right? And so that previous boom that Perth experienced, the house price was almost as high as Sydney. It trebled in 5 years. Everyone's piling to get in, and so he's got to stop. Keith's got to stop trying to chase the next hotspot, right? He's made a commitment. Now, if he's bought a dog of an asset, right? If he's bought a good asset in Hobart, then he's just going to have to ride it out. Hobart will come good again at some point. I've never been a fan personally of investing in Hobart because I just don't think it has the same upward pressure, and it just definitely doesn't have the population or incomes or anything like that. But be that as it may, he's bought in Hobart. He made a decision to buy in Hobart. And if he's bought a good asset in Hobart in terms of Hobart, then, he's got to be thinking, well, I'm just going to sit this out for the long term because the costs of getting in and out, and also chasing Perth. I wouldn't be chasing Perth. I think one of your comments there was chase Melbourne. Go counterintuitive. If you're gonna play that game, go somewhere that's not going gangbusters, and then you get all of the growth when it goes gangbusters. So that's my advice on that one. Don't do it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because John actually was a property investor in Sydney. He sold out at the top. Well, he thought it was the top. It wasn't. He bought in Hobart three and a bit years ago when Hobart was steaming forward. And so this is a serial offender, right, in terms of trying to pick the market and pick the time. I think it's really tricky. And I would remind people that the default rates are highest in Western Australia across the country at the moment. And that's
interesting.
That is because of that earlier boom that we had. We are still seeing the fallout from that earlier boom. It's about 4% default rates at the moment in Western Australia, a lot lower in other states. Now, the point is, markets go up, markets go down, markets move at different rates, and trying to pick your entry and exit point is very, very hard because this is not a frictionless transaction. You've got to take account of the stamp duty and the other fees that you have to pay. And if you're going to sell, you have to sell, probably via an agent, and that's going to be a significant cost too. And if you put the numbers into a spreadsheet, and again, I do say, spreadsheet this. It's really important to do that because people just have this intuitive, I've got to do something. Right? Sometimes the answer is do nothing rather than do something. And
this might not be able to borrow the amount of money again. I mean, the lending environment has changed significantly since he purchased. He might not have the same borrowing capacity. He might not have anything. So,
and the point of all of this is, you can take a knee-jerk reaction and sort of look at the next hot market. Sometimes it's not the right story to actually go after it at all. And that was the end of my conversation with John. It wasn't John, but I'll call him John. Was that?
Oh, sorry, yeah, not according to Keith, but that was
the previous one. No, but the point is that just jumping from one hot to another hot is not necessarily a good strategy. You're going to lose a lot of value potential on the way. And who's going to say when the next hot isn't going to be hot anymore?
Look, it's a shocking strategy. It really is. And it's shocking because even the experts can't predict when the market's going to turn. And even if you could, the timing of selling and buying is really difficult. When for example, you've got a tenant in place, you decide you want to sell a property, you've got to give them notice, right? And then usually that, like if it's in New South Wales, for example, and they're outside a lease, then that's going to be in 90 days. And then after the 90 days, then you've got to get it styled and photographed and maybe painted and the floors done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then it might be 4 months before you get a sale. And so when you've got that time lag, anything can happen in the market in that time. So you're not dealing with something that you can decide, right, I'm going to sell it and I'm going to put it on the market right now. Now, if you lived in that property, you can do that potentially, but not if you have a tenant in place. So it's, you know what I mean? So that adds further complication. I will say that I always encourage people to really try to dial down the white noise about what's happening in the market when they're buying. You got to buy when you are ready to buy. And obviously, if you're an investor, piling into a market that's highly competitive where prices are rising very, very fast and you're competing, everything gets competition. You've got to be really, really discerning and only compete for good quality property. And there's, a hot market masks all sorts of bad decisions. And so that's on the buying side, right? And if you are going to buy in a slower market, then you've got to be just pick the eye teeth out of it. Pick something that's a really good asset. So that's when you buy. You buy when you're ready. You buy when you find the right property, and not trying to control and contrive the market. On the whole, the market spends roughly about 3 times more in growth phase than it does in downturn phase. So the odds are automatically against you trying to pick the right time to buy. On the sell side, however, it's a different kettle of fish. And I already said that, yes, it is difficult to sell an investment quickly if you decide you're going to sell an investment property. But picking your market conditions to sell in, that makes a huge difference to your end result. And I'm a big fan of being very discerning about when you sell.
Absolutely. And the trick is not to be forced to sell. So you can try and pick your time, right? Rather than actually be forced by circumstances. And sometimes, again, in my one-to-one conversations, I find people are being caught now because the circumstances have not gone the way that they hoped with higher interest rates and everything else. And so they start getting to the point where they are forced to do things rather than do things methodically and from a thought through. And actually, those forced decisions are often really painful because you end up potentially not making good decisions because you're forced to make decisions. And sometimes you end up, as a result of that, even more financially worse off. And yet more and more people are being forced into that situation now.
It's a really good point. And so when you're under stress, your available options in your head shrink. And when you've got fewer options or you perceive that you have fewer options, you make worse decisions. And so planning things out is really important. And one of the things I forgot to mention in my, when I was giving my own little bio earlier on, because I do so many things, one of the things that my business does, we do a lot of vendor advisory work. We advise people who are selling across the whole country. So this is not just Sydney-based work that we do. And we do consult with a lot of owners who are selling investment properties, particularly when they're living in one state and the investment property is located in another state. And it's really about helping them choose not just the right selling agent, but it's the process of selling, it's the timing of selling, it's the presentation of that property. And really, should I sell the property? Because if you ask any sales agent, should I sell? Of course, the answer is going to be yes. When should I sell? The answer will be now. How much should I get? Probably going to tell you more than you will get. If you say, how should I present the property, then they'll probably give you some good advice on that. But in terms of the other 3 important questions that people need to be able to answer before deciding whether to sell the property and when to sell the property, you're not going to get good advice from a sales agent. So it's where our vendor advisory service comes in. It's really, really useful to helping people clear through all that cloudy, conflicted information that you're going to get as well, so that you can make clear decisions on whether you should sell, when you should sell, which agent you should sell with. When the offers start coming in, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to work out whether it's a good offer or not, whether you should persist with that buyer or not, so that you get a really good outcome. But really, it's you get one shot at getting it right. And so that's really, really important. And a lot of people that we deal with on the selling side, so when we're buying property for people, we're so focused on good quality assets, right? Now, those good quality assets tend to be easy to sell, right? They're usually difficult to buy. Whereas when we're dealing with vendor advisory, we're often helping people sell properties we would never recommend. So it's a matter of, well, how can we get you out of this property, which isn't a really great asset necessarily and might be really causing you a lot of financial pain, how can we get you out of that property in the smartest way that's going to get you the best outcome and minimize the damage? And that's something that, that we've been doing quite a bit of lately.
Yeah, well, really important questions there, and complex questions and nuance. Again, it comes back to this idea of nuance. There's no simple, straightforward, right answer. You've got to go through the process and ask yourself quite a series of questions.
Yeah.
Now, Leonie asked a question earlier on, which she said that quite often, she was, I think, helping her mum with a property purchase. They would be competing with property investors who seem to have more capacity to borrow more and could make a bigger offer, rather than what she could from a point of view of trying to own a property. So if you look at the sort of property investors and mortgage brokers and how they advise them, are property investors being able to get more of an edge against owner-occupiers in the current environment?
Only if they've got more income. I mean, at the end of the day, it's quite a common rhetoric to go, first home buyers being, outbid by investors. It's not always the case, right? The investor earns more money, then of course, when they've got a lot of equity in their home and all the rest of it, then yeah, sure, if they're in a better financial position. It's not always the case, right? I wouldn't say it's just because they're an investor they've got more money. You know what I mean? It's a bit of a again, nuance. In fact, I hear a lot of investors complaining that first home buyers get bigger incentives than they do, and so they're actually disadvantaged against them. So there you go. It all depends on perspective.
Yeah, grass is always greener, I think, on the other side. Now, here's an interesting one. Somebody looking at a rental property, basically buying off the plan. The developers offer to pay the rent, underwrite the rent for 3 years. So it looks like a good return. Question is, what happens after that? How good are these, developer offered investment property deals at the moment, do you think?
Why do they need to do that? That's all I can say. If it's a really good asset, if it's going to rent easily, why does the developer need to underwrite it?
Simple question. Great, but you should ask lots of questions if they're having to do it, right?
My recommendation is not to buy that sort of property. The developer is trying to minimize your perception of risk. All right. But at the end of the day, you're the one lumped with that asset if it's not a good asset, So it's a marketing tool, but there are bigger risks than that. And I'd be more worried about them than having my rent underwritten. But I've heard so many stories, I'm sure you have too, Martin, of people that after 3 years of underwritten rent, which you have paid for, by the way, in the price that you pay for the property, right? You've paid for that, which again makes it a bad investment. But, at the end of it, the rents can plummet and really take people by surprise, and they haven't factored that in either. So I just would run a mile from any investment property where the rent is underwritten by the developer.
It's too good to be true. There's a reason why they're doing it. They're desperate, and don't touch it is my view as always. I have never seen this come good.
Look, back in, when I was filming actually up in Brisbane, probably about 14, 15 years ago now, I remember seeing billboards advertising for tenants, right? Developers advertising for tenants, offering the tenant 3 months free and a free iPad. And these were on buildings that had been given a rental guarantee, right? And the developers then bleeding because nobody wanted to rent them. Now, I know it's different now. I know it's a different market, but we've got a rental crisis. I don't understand in a rental crisis why a guarantee is needed.
It doesn't add up, does it? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, here's another one to get your teeth into. In fact, I'm going to use Matt Barry's little chart here. Matt Barry's highlighting the fact that they're building dog boxes right up the North Shore train line to ensure that they will tip over the next few years, including a proposal for 45 stories over Gordon. So people in this area, right, if they're looking to buy in either a house or something else in this area, or if they've got a property in these areas and you're seeing this massive development, what's going on and what do you think and what advice would you give to people looking in this area?
So, okay, this is actually quite interesting because we had a client in looking at, wanted to buy some property in Roseville. And we were looking, within that, at the situation within that 400-meter radius of the train station. And, um, you know, it's sort of interesting because the owners of these houses go, oh my God, this is like windfall. Yay, rezoning. I get to, they can build a skyscraper on my block as long as I join up with a few of my neighbors, and we're going to put a syndicate together, and we're going to go to developers, and we're going to go to an agent, and we're going to go to tender, and we're going to get the developers lining up to pay us more than it's worth because it's just windfall day. And the developers are like looking at it and go, nah, doesn't stack up. We're not going to pay you the amount of money that you want for, your 4 houses or whatever. And so you got this stalemate. You get the people that think their development site is worth squillions. The developers going, well, that doesn't stack up. I'm not going. It doesn't matter that it's rezoned and I've got this, additional floor space and et cetera, et cetera. And then you've got people who might actually want to sell and get on with their life. People who might want to downsize, or people maybe moving overseas, or the kids have finished school now and they want to whatever. They're stuck. They actually are gridlocked in a market of instability and uncertainty. And so a lot of these immediate development that's going to happen doesn't transpire. Another thing that happens when people actually do have these big sites, and I'm not talking about the houses bandied together to try to sell for inflated prices to developers who are supposedly too silly to know what a good deal is, but these developers that do have sites, often I've been hearing this story anecdotally, not just in Sydney, but in Melbourne and other cities, where they go, they get the new development approval on that site. It's now worth a hell of a lot more money. They trade the site. So then it's still not being built, still not being developed. It's just worth more. And so they've pocketed their money and they've gone and done whatever else they're going to do. So this rezoning doesn't miraculously then create all of this new development. It's naive to think that suddenly that's what's going to happen. Now, I'm not saying that there hasn't been some 48-story block in Gordon approved. I don't know the detail, and I know that there definitely is some development happening, but it's not as widespread as people just seem to assume is going to immediately happen when they announce these rezoning. And also, when governments too, they announce that they're going to build all these or get these properties built, and all the pressure they put on local councils makes me laugh as well, because it's not the actual council that does the building. So you've got approved sites that have not had commencements. So there's a lot of factors that go into making the development viable, and so then they start the construction on these sites. So I think that might be a slight hyperbole.
Yeah, the bottom line is, if you live close to a rail station in one of these areas, be very afraid, I would say, right? Because
I wouldn't be. I doubt you'll be able to buy one. I think if you live there, yeah, you sort of stuck. Like, I wouldn't be really happy. I'd be pretty upset if I was within the 400-meter zone, and not because a block of units might be built next door, but more because there's this massive high. Who knows how long it's going to take to all get ironed out.
they can't get the builders
you're on mute.
they can't get the builders to build. So it's there's a long path, and unfortunately I suspect that sometimes the allure of wealth creation is destroyed in the process quite often. Now, here's an interesting one from Benny. I don't actually have a very strong view on this, but I don't know much about disability housing. What's the story? I mean, there seems to me to be very little focus on providing good quality housing for those with disability needs. But for me, that's a pretty important issue.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this. I've got just a couple of thoughts. He's put DFA housing. I'm presuming he means defence housing. And so that's different to disability housing. So when I first started as a buyer's agent, I had a lot of fairly naive theories about what I was going to do and how I was going to, make money for my clients. And one of them was I was going to scout out all the defence housing developments that were nearing the end of their contracts and sort of buy them while they were still under a defence housing lease and then resell them when they were available to the open market. But and the reason I had that theory was because when I was a sales agent working at a Balmain in Sydney, there was a couple of defence housing townhouses close by, and I'd sold a few of those properties over the years, and I could see that they really, really undersold compared to equivalent type of property at the time because of the lease that they had. It meant that owner occupiers couldn't buy the property. So once you reduce your buyer pool for a property, you do really constrain the capital growth of that property. And so what I did know though is that some of these contracts were going to be expiring, and I could see that the price of those properties would skyrocket, would have a nice little upkick when those long-term leases expired. They were like 10 and 15-year leases. And that did happen. Those properties did. But then what I did, so when I first started as a buyer's agent, I started researching DFA, or not DFA, that's you, the defence housing developments around to see if I could, source some really good opportunities. And I realised that there's so few that are well located. Most of them are not well located. And in fact, the design of them is generally not that great either. And so I quickly trashed that idea. So no, I'm not a fan of investing in defence housing. The management costs are really high, and yeah, sure, they've got no vacancy rates. They also do a sort of a makeover of the properties with each, turnover of tenancy. So they sort of keep them in top condition, which is great. But, the management fees from memory, something like up to 15%. That's very high. And you've got no discretion. And also you've got very limited constrained capital growth in that period. So I'm not a fan of investing in them. When it comes to disability housing, if it had the same limitations and restrictions, I would say as an investor, yes, you might be providing a good service, but it wouldn't necessarily be a good investment. So if it didn't have that same restriction in terms of could only ever be sold, very, very long leases and only ever be sold to an investor, then, why not? Do it if you want to. But I do think that you've got to be very careful when you're investing in property. I philosophically think our governments should be looking after people that need to be looked after. I don't think that should be left to mum and dad investors. I think that there's been far too much of shirking of responsibility for social housing, public housing in this country. It's been put onto the shoulders of individual investors, and now we've been blamed for the problems that that we have in terms of rental accommodation, and yet our governments have been had a steady decline of investment into public housing. If our needy need housing, they need good housing. But I think it's unfair to put that burden onto the individual investors, and I don't necessarily think it's good investment decision for individual investors.
Yeah, I can concur with that. I think it's something which, from a societal perspective, we need to be thinking about. But trying to funnel it down the property investor path is part of a bigger problem that the government has outsourced a lot of the housing issues to the private sector, to mum and dad investors, and hoping that magically it'll fix it, just as they're now doing with the build to rent strategy. Oh, we'll throw this problem over to overseas investors to solve the problem. Yep. Government has a role, a really critical role, and they've walked away from it.
Yeah, they have. And, we can go on a tangent on here, but, one of the things that I really find quite interesting at the minute, particularly the Victorian government and a lot of their legislation, tenancy legislation. Now, they've got habitability standards. So there's been, quite a big, quite onerous burden placed on landlords to upgrade their properties. And that's great, right? That's fantastic. But when you upgrade a property, to the point where a tenant who's got more money and can afford more rent than somebody who is in a more needy position can afford to pay, you're inadvertently displacing people that are at the lowest, on the lower rungs of that property and the rental ladder. And, I also think what a hypocrisy, because to my knowledge, from whenever I've looked at public housing, it wouldn't pass any habitability standards, in my view. So it's very hypocritical to put that burden again onto individual investors when the government isn't even looking after its own housing stock in such a way. So anyway, don't get me started on that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Did you see this? That NAB came out and said that the new tax laws won't fix build-to-rent woes. I think they're right, and this is being spruiked by the government as another silver bullet. And I don't think we have any silver bullets, and I think there's a whole bunch of questions that need to be asked and not answered yet so far. We will see. Now, here's an interesting little tweak on the conversation. Let me just put this question up here. This came in earlier on from the Manifesting Better. Thoughts on BlackRock CEO Larry Fink suggesting the tokenization of every financial asset like stocks, bonds, and property should actually be, but what about the tokenization of property and the financialization of property? I would lead off with saying we've been messed over by the financialization of property. I'm not sure we want more of it.
I think anybody who sort of goes down this path is failing to understand that property is shelter. It's a roof over our heads. If you're just investing in it, maybe, but people live in it, and there's emotional quotient there as well, in the sense that, I have a certain amount of pride about where I live and what I live in, and there's value in that, and it's very complicated. You can't compare the property market in totality to the share market. And that's one of the key reasons why you can't. There's lots of other reasons. I mean, there's illiquidity, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but it's not the same type of asset. And I think that's why you just can't lump it in the same bucket.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I've had this view for some time that the more financialized we're going, the worse it gets, because effectively it tilts the playing field away from housing as somewhere to live, comfort and shelter, and more towards a financial investment. And it's then compared, and I've seen articles comparing property performance with shares and other things, and so it's part of the financial world, but it's not good. And one of the reasons why we have such high house prices at the moment is because of this financialization process has gone on over the last 30 to 40 years. The UN has said it, and you look at it in Australia. But as Jason said, it's probably going to happen anyway. Who knows?
Well,
okay.
I don't know about that, because I mean, look at CoreLogic's Hedonic Index, right? It's a way to try to give you a daily property value for the country, right? But does that really translate into that's what this property is going to sell for, or that property is going to sell for? You know what I mean? So it doesn't get, we're not, unless we see a future where we are going to trade, we're going to have fractional trading in all properties. I can't see it, and every property gets lumped in the bucket, and and it doesn't matter. It's like, look, I was in Vietnam last week. I went to the silver shop, and there's all these beautiful necklaces, and some of them are really intricate, and some of them are really plain. And when you buy them, they just go and weigh it, and it's the intricacy and the workmanship isn't taken into account with the price. It's purely you buy based on the weight of the silver. So that's what they're sort of proposing for the property market. I can't really see that happening.
No, I tend to agree as well. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Well, we're sort of coming, I think, to the end of our conversation. I did have a few other questions, but I think we've covered a lot of them in our broad conversation. But I just had one last one. This is from Josephine. So she asked, Veronica, you often talk about dogs and stars, quality properties versus not quality properties. Can you take us through from first principles? What do you mean by quality properties versus not quality properties? What are dogs? What are stars? How do we know the difference?
Megan, my co-host on Your First Home Buyer Guide, and we talk about this a lot. And in fact, we've done episodes on this on the Your First Home Buyer Guide podcast. So I can't remember exactly which episode. I feel like it's 46, but it might not be. Anyway, so I look at A, B, and C grade properties. And if I can put it to you this way, there's very few properties, and it comes really, the thinking for me came from when I was a sales agent. When I was a sales agent, You learn what properties sell easily, sell well, and which ones don't. And when you really break it down, why does some properties sell really well? They sell because they have appeal to that marketplace. And in one suburb, an A grade property might be different to what's an A grade in another suburb as well, because local buyers have preferences, right? So, you want to look at a property that people will fight for. And quite often when the market's rising, people want to avoid competing for property because it's painful to keep missing out and painful to be forced to pay a bit more. But the reality is, if you buy a property that is competitive and will continue to be competitive, then that's an A grade property. And because these properties can be competitive in a flat market as well. So they don't need a boom to get good prices. And they're the sorts of properties that are sought after, that people will say, oh my God, I want to be on that street. It's tree lined. It's pretty. The street next door might not be tree lined. It's the location, it's the aspect. So if that tree lined street might have one side of houses where the backyards face north, the other side, the backyards face south, the north facing gardens are always going to be preferable than the south-facing gardens. If the floor plan doesn't work, that's going to cause friction in living in the property, and people don't like that. If the bedrooms are really small or they're a weird shape, they don't like that. So they want a well-proportioned home, which is in the style of the area, that architectural style that fits in with the area that people like. There's all these sorts of characteristics that we look for in a property. Natural light is very important. Outlook, and it doesn't have to be a view, doesn't have to be a sea view. It just has to be a pleasant outlook. So you've got to start thinking about being really critical about a property and go, is this something that people want to live in, want to have? And that's fundamentally an A-grade property. Whereas the properties that, on a main road, on the bottom of the hill, in the dank, dark, leafy, leech infested part of the suburb, the stuff that people will only go for when it's a hot market and they can't afford anything else, that's the stuff to run away from and avoid. You got to go for top shelf. And top shelf doesn't have to be expensive. It can be still a little house or a little apartment, and it doesn't have to be an expensive suburb even. It's just that in each area you've got these little pockets where people will compete for something in that area because they really want to be there, desirable and scarce. I hope that helps.
Certainly does. And, it goes right back to what we said. Nuance, go granular. Not all property behaves the same way. You need to understand the characteristics. So that's the first sort of big principle. The second principle is you need to do your homework and you need to actually go through the thinking. And I'm a great believer in spreadsheeting some of this out and seeing how the cash flows work and those sorts of things. Do your due diligence, make sure you know what you're getting into. And thirdly, you made a very important point earlier on. I just want to reiterate it. This is not a point in time thing. This is a point of time thing with consequences, right? And so you should be thinking not only about today, but also, let's say, the next 5 years. I think a minimum of 5 years is probably the right time frame, maybe 5 to 7 years, to think through. So in other words, are you making the right decision today, but is it also the same right decision for the next few months and years? So often I find that people actually have made a decision which looked logical at the time, but completely failed to take account of life, dear boy, life.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so we do that certainly in your first home buyer guide. Megan and I really encourage people to look at that longer lens, at least 5 years. We really like to think 5 to 10 years. And it is really about pulling yourself out and just looking at, holistically, the bigger picture, the long term, because there's just so much short termism when it comes to property in this country. And I really encourage you to think that if you make a bad decision, you're lumbered with it for a long time and can really painful, costly, and exhausting to try to extricate yourself from. So to avoid that, make good decisions.
Yeah, and be informed and use the right tools. And I want to just underscore the pantheon of tools that you have available on your various sites. I don't know how people can find their way around, but veronicamorgan.com.au is a good way in from there you can
That'll
pretty
point
much
you in the direction. Yeah.
exactly right. And some of the courses that you actually run, I think are brilliant. And also, I think the elephant in the room with Chris Bates, I had Chris Bates on a few weeks ago. Those are really insightful, because what you're doing there is really casting a spotlight into areas of the property market that nobody ever thinks about.
We're just trying to get people to think, and I think that's really that's what we do. If we can get you to think about it, to understand that there is a process involved, and that there's no short term, no silver bullets. There's work to be done, and if you take the time to do the work, be careful about your decisions, you can do very well with property. But it's that knee jerking, the chasing hot. Anyway, there's just so many mistakes people can make, but you take the time to get it right, it can really set you up well. It's just lots of people don't do it well, and sadly it will take them years to work it out too, and then they start to realize that they've wasted time, energy, money, and it's just painful. Don't want you to feel that.
Yeah, and it's a bit like, riding a bicycle. It takes a bit of time to learn how to ride a bicycle, then you can ride it. But frankly, you don't buy that much property. So therefore, learn from those people who've been through the journey, and learn from those who actually are trying to help, rather than just trying to muddle your way through, because you can make really bad, expensive decisions and end up in a really bad place. And it can happen quite quickly. And I see that quite often in my one-to-one conversations. I also see people who actually make good decisions and have done quite well from property. So I'm not a property bear. I'm not a property bull. I'm a property realist. And, that's how I think about it. And I think the conversation I've seen in the chat already, a lot of people really appreciative of your thoughts and opinions there, Veronica. And you're really down to earth guidance. So it's been absolutely great. Thank you so much.
I hope it helps. Thank you. My pleasure. It's good to see you again, Martin.
Yeah, take care. I'm going to take you offline. Then we're going to close the show. And have a great Christmas, great New Year. And I look forward to catching up again with you in 2025, when we'll see where the property market goes next. Who knows?
Hope it snows for Christmas for you on your new roof.
Cheers. Take care. Bye.
See ya. Bye.
There you go. Well, I hope you found that interesting, useful. Veronica's great, and always huge value in terms of thinking about property. Just to say that next week, Leith Van Onselen will be on, and he'll be talking about some of the latest economic data, and of course, a lot to talk about there. So mark your diary for that one, and it should be a really interesting conversation. Anyway, thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. Just before I go, the dogs are still here, sound asleep, looking as though they're not going to move all day, but they'll probably get up when it comes to lunchtime. And I'll look forward to seeing you on the next live show, which will be next Tuesday. And of course, we'll be doing the daily shows recorded fashion over the rest of the week. Thank you very much for all the super chats, Jason, and others who actually contributed for the super chat. Really appreciate it. Really helps to cover the costs. Hope you have a good evening, and look forward to seeing you on the next show. Hopefully it'll be quieter in a week or two at least, because my roof will be complete. But I think we got through without too many noises off. So take care. We'll see you next time. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. Cheerio.